Apologies for the delay starting just now, and thank you all for joining us. I'm David Borden, Executive Director of StopTheDrugWar.org. This is our 12th event at or in conjunction with international meetings on the topic of human rights in the Philippines. We are holding this event at the margins, the online margins of the UN's high-level political forum on sustainable development, a massive world effort to address the world's great challenges. One of the goals, number 16, is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And so issues like human rights, accountability, and so forth fall within that topic. Our first event was held in March 2017 at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna, where we were privileged to present a video from then Vice President Leni Robredo, a video which became controversial in the Philippines due to attacks being made on her by political opponents. Vice President Robredo was in her first year of her term as Vice President, having narrowly defeated Bongbong Marcos to win that post. As probably everyone here is well aware, Marcos is now the president, having defeated Robredo, and we will discuss as part of our discussion today. We will touch on the ramifications of that. I will also, before turning this over to my co-moderator, Marco Perduca, I will just lastly note that it's nearly 5.5 years since then Senator Leila de Lima was first jailed, and we share the widespread hopes in the international community that she will be released soon, particularly since I think it was 3 of her initial key accusers have recanted their accusations and stated that they were made under pressure. So thank you, and Marco, to you.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I think we're distributed almost equally around the world today. July 17th marks the International Day for Justice, or Criminal Justice. The 17th of July, 1998, it was the conclusion of the diplomatic conference of plenipotentiary that took place in Rome to adopt the statute of the International Criminal Court. I was there, so for once we can have someone that witnessed not only that day, but also the 4 years that led to the finalization of that document. The idea of having an international criminal court was floated around when the United Nations were founded in the mid-40s, but gained traction in the late 80s when the president of Trinidad and Tobago went before the General Assembly to urge the international community to establish an international court, criminal court, in particular to take care of all the possible crimes, narco-trafficking, so the trafficking of illicit narcotics. The idea was duly noted, but not expanded or developed until, unfortunately, the events in the Balkans and in the Great Lake regions also called for international justice, super partes international justice, to come in whenever violations of international humanitarian law were occurring. It is also thanks to the Italian government and my former organization, the Radical Party, and the proactive work of Emma Bonino, who at that time was member of the Italian Parliament and eventually in '95 became European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, that the Italian government offered to host the conference in Rome, paying for all the costs that would have entailed. And Rome is a seat of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and for 5 weeks, diplomats coming from all over the world met to come at the compromise solution, which wasn't liked by many groups, non-governmental organizations included. But we thought that if we couldn't take that opportunity to finally come at a conclusion of a very long debate, it would have the entire idea of having international justice would not have been at hand anymore. And if we look at the world of 1998, the type of governments in Europe, the United States, but I would also say Australia, New Zealand, and to a certain extent, the Caribbeans and Egypt, for that matter, because they were all in a way or another involved in finalizing the document, and we look at the world as it was after 9/11, I think it was a good decision to conclude the conference there and not have an encore in a couple of years as they did for the landmine treaties. The core crimes of the current International Criminal Court are genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 10 years ago, also the crime of aggression was included as a core crime, and we are now witnessing a war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. And so if Russia had recognized the competence of the court, and also the Ukraine had done so in the past, and in fact, partly they did after Crimea was annexed illegally by Russia, that court could have jurisdiction over it. So to recap, the court has jurisdiction over countries that have signed and ratified or have acceded the treaty, and in a way have put in place all the necessary measures to collaborate with the court or allow the court to take action if local authorities are unwilling or unable to pursue alleged criminals at any level of the state hierarchy, from the top, meaning the president of the republic, down to the chain of command that has ordered or not done enough to block violations of international humanitarian law. Since the event that Dave reminded before of 2017, we have made the case before competent authorities, the ICC included, that the way in which the war on drugs had been waged in the Philippines amounted to crimes against humanity. It was massive and systematic, and it was the result of a specific order gave by someone in charge of doing possibly the opposite. That is, not only to protect their civilians from abuse of national authorities or the police or the army, but also to try and provide assistance in case of addiction. The United Nations has changed its stance when it comes to drug policy or the international system of drug control, and now they're always including the need to provide human rights-centered or humane treatment of people when it comes to take care of illicit trafficking or use of those substances. Unfortunately, for at least the last 3 years, we have seen inhuman and degrading treatment of people that take drugs in the Philippines, and also the people that wanted to criticize the way in which those campaigns have been going on. So we know, and with this I will conclude, that the Philippines was party to the treaty until a few years ago. So some of those heinous actions still fall under the jurisdiction of the ICC. The jurisdiction has opened an investigation. There are currently, well, the ICC has taken care of 31 cases. Some are still ongoing. Some have been acquitted. Some have been convicted. Some are of the responsible are still at large. What I think we will hear today is a recap of how things have happened in a way or haven't happened in another way when it came to the Philippines, because it is important to remind that without the proactive work of non-governmental organizations, the ICC will not be there. It will still be a good idea that they were technically possible, but politically never pursued because there was not enough will here and there to arrive at the political conclusion. We are happy to have 3 distinguished speakers today with us. Justin Bolain, I apologize for the pronunciation, Ruba Carranza, and then Aurora Perong. I think they will speak in this order, if I'm correct. So Justice Balen is a Filipino human rights activist based in Metro Manila. He's currently the Secretary General of Akbayan Youth, the youth wing of the Democratic Socialist Akbayan Party in the Philippines. He also served as the Philippine Ambassador of Students for Sensible Drug Policy in 2018 and the Vice President for the Asia Pacific International Union of Socialist Youth, where he's spoken extensively about the state of justice and human rights under the Duterte drug war. Justin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marco, and good evening and good morning to everyone in the Zoom. I'm going to share about the state of the killings under the final months of Duterte and the government's failure to investigate all of these. I'm going to start first with recounting that at the first half of the year, during the campaign season, the streets were blaring with the jingle of the new president, vice president, which started with the lines, Bagong Pilipinas, Bagong Mukha. It roughly translates to new Philippines and new faces, but in reality, it's not. In the first half month under Marcos and Duterte, we're being shown of the same drug war tactics and the same level of government repression. So for tonight, I'll be talking about how the killings haven't stopped with Duterte leaving and how late with him later gone, and how the killings have largely remained uninvestigated and the killers let loose under Duterte and possibly Marcos. So we start first with how the killings have continued unabated even in Duterte's final months in office. Data from the University of the Philippines Third World Studies Center showed that there have been 155 deaths for the first half of the year. And even in Duterte's final years in office, the killing of children in the drug war has continued. As a cruel farewell reminder, the drug war killed 38 people, including 2 children, in the last month of Duterte in Malacanang. It can be remembered that 2 years ago, the Human Rights Watch has reported that more than 122 children have already been killed under the drug war. In UP's research, from January to July 2022, 68 of the deaths were carried out by state agents. And this is one of the highest tally among assailants in the University of the Philippines research. There's also, I'm relying and I'm citing on the University of the Philippines data because there's a huge underreporting crisis on drug war numbers that even the government itself has lost itself in its web of legalese and, dare I say, deception. This year, before Duterte left office, the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency reported that there has been a total of 6,248 drug war deaths since Duterte took office. This is a figure that is at least 24,000 lower than the estimates of the Philippine Commission on Human Rights and other human rights groups. And this is even lower than the figure provided by the Office of Duterte. In 2017, remember that the presidential office may have admitted itself that the drug war killed 20,000 people and listed it as one of its annual accomplishment report under the section Fighting Illegal Drugs in 2017. And this case and this accomplishment report by the Office of Duterte became the basis of the Supreme Court order to the Duterte government to explain and release data on the 20,000 deaths, which could be state-sponsored. And so later on, the government submitted data that a news site, Rappler, called Rubbish. It described that the files submitted to them were irrelevant or there were already missing cases that could have involved killings during state operations. Last year, when I spoke in the same side event, I reported that the Philippine Department of Justice vowed to the international community that they are able and that they are willing to conduct a domestic review on the drug war cases just to show that the justice system is still working in the country. But this year, the Department of Justice announced to the United Nations that only 4 cases have led to actual new prosecution. Imagine that, 4 cases out of more than 30,000 reported or suspected cases under the drug war. I think that's showing that this government is being non-committal and not being serious about its obligations to the international community in upholding its human rights obligations. Because to date, there remains only one case that led to a guilty verdict against killer cops, and that was in 2018 on the murder of 17-year-old Kian de los Santos. That's because the norm is of acquitting and letting killer cops go scot-free. Last month, the Office of the President dismissed charges against Colonel Lito Patay. He's the station head in a city here in Metro Manila whose team was accused of killing a 17-year-old boy in one of the slum areas here in Metro Manila. So you see, the prospects of investigation and bringing to justice the cases and the killings that have happened under the Duterte administration remain bleak. Now, what are the prospects under the Marcos administration? A week into Bongbong Marcos's presidency, one person a day is killed, approximately. This is according to data from the Third World Study Center of UP. And you can also note that an official of the Marcos government vowed that the drug war will be as intensive as before. Even the President Marcos himself, during the campaign trail, said that he will continue the drug war with the same vigor but a different approach. But we continue to question the government's seriousness to put into law any program that is an alternative to what the law enforcement agencies have already been accustomed to under Duterte, because they've already been so comfortable with getting away with their crimes that it can be remembered that as early as 2017, Senator Riz Hontiveros of Akbayan already filed a bill in Senate providing the framework for a public health approach on the drug problem. But until now, there has been no push from others in the Senate or anyone else in the legislative chambers or the executive to pass it or to adopt elements of it even, highlighting the importance of harm reduction instead of the current punitive, violent, and largely failed approach of the Duterte administration. After the elections, we spoke with Nanette Castillo, who lost his only son, 20-year-old Aldrin Castillo in 2017, and she said she felt dismayed with the election results and with Marcos winning because she knows that the new government will not listen to them who are victims of extrajudicial killings. And this is significant because Marcos Jr., who sits in the office of the president, refuses to be accountable for the extrajudicial killings that have happened under his family's regime in the 70s. So what more with the previous governments?
Thank you, Justin. I think with Aurora Parong that I didn't introduce before, we can also touch upon the medical situation as she is a doctor. But now the floor goes to Ruben Carranza, who is one of the International Center for Transitional Justice leading senior expert on the reparations since 2009. In that capacity, he has provided technical support on reparations to victims groups, civil society and policymakers worldwide, more recently in Nepal, Kenya, Armenia, Tunisia, and the Philippines. He has a very long CV, and we will share it later because I think it's more important and interesting now to have his views. I've also seen that some colleagues from No Peace Without Justice are in the Zoom room, so they shouldn't, I don't want to pick on them, but if they have additional info that they want to share, I would like to remind that Alison Smith was with us 5 years ago from No Peace Without Justice, and they have been very, very helpful together with the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines in the work that has been done to document what unfortunately has happened in the Philippines since the arrival of President Duterte. Ruben, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you, Stop the Drug War, for the work you do and for inviting me to speak. I'm glad that Justin laid out the context of the drug war as it is, and it's important to note that the drug war is not over. And for those of you who watch American television, there's this famous quote from The Wire, that TV series about drug wars, that drug wars are not actual wars because drug wars never end. And that's the situation in the Philippines right now. On the first day of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as president, which was also the last day of Rodrigo Duterte as president, there were drug war killings in the University of the Philippines inside its campus involving these two brothers who were very poor, coming from a very poor family. Regine Cabato of the Washington Post included their killing in her story about the continuity of the drug war under Marcos Jr. The brothers were invited by a supposed friend to help fix a car, but instead they were taken by plainclothes armed men in a car that was unmarked and taken from the university, and then their bodies were found 2 days later. Very poor family from one of the urban poor communities that have settled inside the University of the Philippines campus. I mentioned this example because many, many years ago, when I was a student at the University of the Philippines, after the Marcos dictatorship, an unmarked car bearing armed men actually abducted one of the staffers of the campus newspaper, the student newspaper I was editing at that time. And he was fortunately found much later, detained in a police camp, charged with being part of a killing of U.S. servicemen, and eventually convicted and imprisoned. He has been released, but I mentioned this example because the continuation of the drug war isn't, in many ways, isn't contingent on who the president is now. Part of what the drug war unleashed, part of what Duterte unleashed, has been the creation of a national death squad that has now come to exist apart from Duterte himself. And so it's important to mention this because I don't think we can reckon with accountability for the drug war based on who the president of the Philippines is. It's important to look at the institutions that enforce the drug war, both the formal state institutions, the Philippine National Police, and the non-institutional and yet much more powerful creations that the drug war has led to. A death squad that used to be local, Davao City, has become national under Duterte, and this national death squad continues. In the same story that appeared in the Washington Post, there's mention of a press conference held by the current chief of the Philippine National Police, Vicente Danao, saying that these two brothers who were supposedly killed by the police in a shootout had 68 million pesos worth of street-level shabu, a drug, with them when they were killed. Vicente Danao, the current police chief, was Duterte's former police chief in Davao City. And Vicente Danao has a record, not just of being involved in the drug wars in Davao, but also of domestic abuse for which he was exposed by his wife and had to take a leave from his police duties in Davao until Duterte, of course, forgave him and then said he will back him up. And this is how he has been backed up. Vicente Danao is likely to be one of those that if the prosecutor goes ahead with the investigation that has already been authorized previously by the pretrial chambers of the ICC, pretrial chamber of the ICC, and the prosecutor now wants to issue, Vicente Danao is likely to be one of those to be investigated. It's difficult to say at this point whether Vicente Danao or anyone else for that matter will be charged. But obviously, those who have been linked to the death squad in Davao and now operate on a national scale are likely to be those who will be investigated. And potentially charged. This isn't only because of their links to the death squads in Davao and then nationwide. This is also because the ICC prosecutor, with the approval of the pretrial chamber, has actually extended the coverage of that investigation of the Philippines drug war to the period when Duterte was mayor of Davao. In other words, after the ICC treaty took effect for the Philippines in 2011, and years before Rodrigo Duterte became president, it's interesting as well that in this period covered by the ICC prosecutor's investigation of the Philippine drug war, Rodrigo Duterte was mayor, but there were periods. There's a period, if I'm not mistaken, in which his daughter was mayor of Davao because they took turns becoming mayor. So this is important to remember that the prosecutor extended the coverage of the investigation to prior to the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. But there's two other points that I'd like to mention here. It's important to remember as well that the International Criminal Court is not the only institution that can pursue accountability for the drug war. It's important to remember that prosecution is not the only measure by which extrajudicial killings, crimes against humanity committed in the drug war can be pursued and those behind them be held accountable. Justice doesn't only equate with courts. It's important to remember that justice can be pursued elsewhere, outside courts. And I've emphasized this in the work that ICTJ does in transitional justice. Because here we have a transition from Duterte to Marcos. Is there hope for a transitional justice process for the drug war, even if Marcos Jr. has indicated that he will continue, according to him at least, most of what has happened under Duterte? There are two ways in which I think the accountability and justice for the drug war can be pursued even outside of the International Criminal Court's process. One is through a truth-telling process that can be organized at the local level, perhaps at the community level in the Philippines, among the urban poor communities that have been targeted by the drug war. Part of that work is being done now by priests like my friend Father Fabi Villanueva, and the exhumations and the reburials and cremations of those whose bodies were buried in cemeteries, whose families cannot afford to keep those bodies and pay for the burial plots. So that process of removing the remains and then having my friend as well, one of the forensic pathologists in the Philippines, Dr. Raquel Fortun, exhume and examine the bodies, conduct autopsies, is a truth-telling process. It's important to support that. It's important for the international community to support that, because this not only empowers communities, empowers families of the victims into acting on their demands for justice, but gives them some hope that even if there's no formal state process that seeks accountability within the Philippines, even if the ICC prosecutor will take longer to actually investigate, conduct the investigation, and even if that investigation happens and the ICC as a court cannot proceed because the Philippines does not cooperate with the ICC, that there are local processes going on outside of court processes. The second approach to justice for the drug war involves reparations for families of the drug war victims. The Philippines reparations isn't new in the Philippines. The Philippines actually passed a law in 2013 under former President Benigno Aquino to provide reparations for victims of the Marcos dictatorship. I was involved in the drafting of that law when I was still a commissioner in the Philippines commission that went after the ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses. And one of the last official acts I did as a commissioner in 2003 was to draft the bill that 10 years later became the reparations law for victims of the Marcos dictatorship. So the Philippines knows what reparations is and has given reparations for victims. So it is possible for reparations to be given to victims of the drug war. But is it possible to do that under Marcos? I am not saying that this is an indication of that possibility, but the sister of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., a senator, Amy Marcos, actually supported a bill that became a law in the Philippines that gave reparations for those who were victimized and displaced in the siege in Marawi City, involving a conflict between a violent extremist group in the Philippine South and the government, leading to the displacement and killing of tens of thousands of people. Amy Marcos, the sister of the president of the Philippines right now, actually supported this reparations law. Whether for her own interests and whether in a selective way, of course, is a separate discussion. So truth-telling, reparations are possible for victims of the drug war. But will Marcos Jr. himself pursue the killings, pursue accountability of those involving the killings in Duterte's drug war? That, I think, is a question that, of course, can be fully answered over time. But I think two things that we need to take into account. Marcos Jr. is no stranger to maintaining impunity. He and his family have an interest in maintaining the impunity of Duterte, because any action that might open accountability of presidents past and even further in the past will obviously reopen questions around the accountability of the Marcos family. A second point to remember here is that the Marcoses will defend their ill-gotten wealth for as long as they can. To me, that has always been the most important part of the Marcoses as far as their legacy is concerned, to make sure that the ill-gotten wealth is not recovered. A third and final point, Marcos Jr. will say what the global North's elites will want to hear, what the West, particularly including Europeans in the western part of Europe, will want to hear, that he will go pursue accountability for human rights violations. He has said this to the resident coordinator of the United Nations in the Philippines, that he will pursue preventive health-related policies for drug users. This is, of course, appealing to Westerners, but does not deal with the root causes of drug use in urban poor communities in the first place, and the economic and social rights violations that then lead to drug use in the Philippines. There is an ongoing joint project between the United Nations and the Philippines that came out of the Human Rights Council process. But this joint project focuses on capacity building and not on accountability. So it's important to look at these various aspects of what the Marcos government, Marcos Jr.'s government, inherits from Rodrigo Duterte, and determine whether his words are matched by actions. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Ruben. I think there's plenty of bad news, unfortunately, that can be debated afterwards. We will keep a Q&A session after the next speaker, who's Aurora Perong. Aurora is a medical doctor with extensive work on health, human rights, and justice. She has been 40 years of national and international work focused on human rights and international humanitarian law. She trained on human rights advocacy at the Institute for Human Rights at Columbia University in New York, and holds a diploma in international humanitarian law. She's the vice chairperson of Amnesty International Philippines and co-chairperson of the Philippine Coalition for the International Criminal Court, PCICC, and she campaigned for the ratification of the Rome Statute. Aurora, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you, David, for organizing this event. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. Looks like we have different timelines. Let me start by taking off from what Ruben said about the UN Technical Assistance Agreement with the Philippines and the Philippine government. In fact, the Philippine Coalition for the ICC is calling on the UN to review the effect and assess the effectiveness of its technical assistance and review its decision not to probe into the war on drugs. That find the findings of Dr. Raquel Fortun, and of course also the statement of the Prosecutor Khan of the ICC, that there is no effective investigation and real looking into the systematic nature of the crimes according to the documents that they reviewed, which were submitted by the Philippines. And therefore, that call for the UN Human Rights Council to review its decision is out on the, we are putting that forward. We also call on the UNHRC that if ever it continues with capacity building, because it's also important, but in order not to get it into waste, there should be key result areas or impact assessment of its assistance to the Philippines. Perhaps one would be effective prosecution of perpetrators of the killings in the war on drugs can be an impact or a result that should be achieved, because there should be changes in behavior and values of those who are trained during this technical assistance. And then, of course, there should be that effort to really look at the enablers, those who made it possible that there's massive killing in the tens of thousands. We also believe that if President Marcos is really, Jr. is really committed to high accountability and to pursue the control of drugs within the rule of law, they should develop a program against drug abuse that integrates a human rights and public health perspective. And that should be put in the terms of reference or impact of the assistance that is being given by the UN right now. And of course, the Philippine government has to really give concrete results of what it says as it will pursue the war and the fight against drugs within the rule of law and make high accountability possible. Then it should now come out with a very, very concrete plan and not just say that it is within the rule of law. There has to be specifics. There has to be terms of reference, items on the plan, and concrete results and key result areas that can be measured, and not just those general commitments to the rule of law or accountability. Of course, they said if they're meant for, they want unity as well as peace so that we can get out of this pandemic of the crisis, then there has to be that showing that they should review the withdrawal from the International Criminal Court and consider the possibility of getting back if they really want higher accountability. In relation to the problems of the International Criminal Court, we are still waiting for the pre-trial chamber to make a decision for the resumption of the investigation. However, we also note that the ICC, particularly the OTP, Office of the Prosecutor, is looking at so many cases, many situations, whether in investigations itself, it is looking at 16 situations, including the Philippines, including that of Ukraine, including that of Myanmar, Bangladesh, and some cases in the African countries, which had started long ago in 2004 when the ICC was just established. So there's really so many things that has to be done, and they have problems. First, resources. We think that the international community, especially the Assembly of States parties of the Rome Statute should in fact provide the resources which the court needs in order to be able to really act as a court of last resort and deliver justice faster also rather than being at the back burner for investigation, and then it's only after some time that the court can act on them because they have no resources and that is adequate enough to pursue all these cases that they are either investigating on preliminary examinations or even those which are on trial. So there has to be more resources and support, not just from the state parties, I think, because if other members of the UN really believe in international justice and support it, then they should support whatever is at the international court's purview to review and make decisions on. Secondly, I'd like to say that the Philippine president has in the past attacked the ICC as an institution. It also attacked UN officials and ICC personnel, and they said they will never allow ICC personnel to come in. During the campaign, the current president said that he will only allow the ICC personnel to come in as tourists, not as investigators. And so I don't think there's anything good in that. So we think that the UN members, as well as the Assembly of State parties of the Rome Statute, should be giving political support to the ICC when there is an effort to attack them or diminish their capacities to do their work because they don't have access to the countries that need to be investigated. I think I'll end with that. I would like to say that the Philippine Coalition will continue its education and info work among government as well as the people, so they will understand and recognize the importance of a court of last resort when domestic institutions fail to deliver. As we do this, we continue to assist the victims in their biopsychosocial needs, in their security needs, and their efforts to seek justice. And of course, we would want that the Philippines will come back within the ICC fold. So we hope that our appeal to governments and the international community and the international bodies will not fall into deaf ears. Justice must not slip on the victims of serious violations and crimes and their families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aurora. If people in the room would like to pose a question, there's a button that's called reaction. You can raise your Zoom hand and then we can give you the floor. In the meantime, if Dave doesn't have a question, I have a question, which is we don't like paying lip service to this or that. So given that the Philippines left the ICC, I don't know if actually the process of leaving the ICC has been finalized in all its complicated details, but let's assume it has. Would, in particular, after what now Ruben and Aurora have said, should we lobby the European Union or European Commission, but also the United States, on the critical issue of conditionality? That is, shall we ask them to deal with the newly elected president that has a very heavy family name of the Philippines, saying, look, unless they not only tell you that they're going to do it, but they demonstrate that they're going to do it, what they will say they are going to do it, you should try and negotiate any kind of in bilateral or multilateral cooperation with them. Of course, a democratically elected member, head of state cannot be not recognized. And I think some of our diplomats were present in those days and followed the electoral campaign. But I think when it comes to bilateral or multilateral cooperation, also in economic terms, a little bit of conditionality should also play. We know that the EU in particular doesn't like that clause too much, but because of after what we have seen happening in the Philippines and the way in which, for instance, some countries finally have started to not only pledge, but also allocate resources to the ICC, reuse that infamous part of the European internal regulations would be a good thing. That is my first question, but I think Dave has another question. And to follow the example of Dave, that is the Zoom hand that I was talking about before. So, and then we have Cristina Regina Bonan. And then we go to answers, and then we allow another round of 3 questions. Dave, you have the floor.
Well, I wanted to note a question in the chat from Esther Isberto. And Mrs. Berto, you'll be welcome to speak if you want to, but I'll relate the question also, add my own to it. She asks if the ICC investigators are allowed to enter the Philippines only as tourists. Is it possible for the ICC to invite witnesses to go to them instead so they can get their narratives outside of the Philippines? I would add my question to that, and then to hear from our ICC experts here. Am I right in my understanding that the government's position, although it may make things more difficult, mainly means that the ICC will be more circumspect in terms of how it does its investigations, who is carrying them out, and so forth?
Thank you, Dave. I apologize, Esther, I didn't see the question. Then Christine, and then we go back to our panelists. You have the floor. Christina, you need to unmute your microphone. There you go.
Yes, thank you. Hi. My question is related to something that Doc Al Parong had already alluded to. My question is related to the Philippine government had pointed to the ongoing technical assistance with the UN that stemmed from the recommendations of the Human Rights Council as a reason to suspend any investigations on the Philippines by the ICC. So do you think that the different UN human rights mechanisms and how they operate, like differently, with some more political or consensus based than others, might conflict in their approaches and actually perhaps delay the ends of justice or rights protection? Or in a different way, can governments use these different mechanisms to their strategic advantage in a way?
Thank you, Christina. Who wants to go first? You can raise also your physical hand, not necessarily the Zoom hand. So, Ruben.
Yeah, sure. Let me take some of the questions that have, some legal aspects to them, but also some policy aspects. The question about whether witnesses can be brought outside the Philippines, because the current government has indicated that it will not allow ICC prosecutors to come in. That's what the prosecutor has done, in fact. And of course, the prosecutor is at liberty to say exactly how and who these witnesses are, but we know that there are insider witnesses whose statements were in large part the basis for the investigation and for the original authorization granted to the prosecutor to investigate the crimes against humanity in the drug war. So that means, yes, the ICC can in fact interview witnesses outside. Not just the ICC, other UN human rights mechanisms have done that in their own inquiries. So a good example is the Commission of Inquiry on War Crimes in Sri Lanka, which was not allowed by the Sri Lankan government, which, by the way, has been toppled, or at least the same government people who retook power have now been toppled. The Commission of Inquiry on Sri Lanka actually conducted its interviews mostly in London, bringing out Sri Lankans to the country. So it's possible. This, however, means that many other witnesses potentially who have not come out, who are afraid to come out, have to be located, and this complicates matters. It's not impossible, I think, for the Philippines to actually allow ICC investigators to come in. There might be a way to use the capacity building process in the UN joint project to actually have ICC investigators come in, perhaps to train other investigators in interviews. This has been done in the past in the same context, in the drug wars. That's the reason why the current prosecutor, for example, Karim Khan, actually went to the Philippines before he became prosecutor to meet with families of the drug war victims. Marcos Jr. himself, when he was senator, actually signed the ratification process for the ICC treaty, which makes it ridiculous that his own sister criticizes the possibility of the Philippines rejoining the ICC because her own brother, who is now president, actually supported the Philippine entry into the International Criminal Court. So that's the answer to that question. On the question of conditionalities that you asked, Marco, let's use the Sri Lanka example again. The European Union imposed tariff limitations on Sri Lanka at the height of the Sri Lankan war against Tamil rebels, which led to thousands of war crimes and impunity for, again, the same brothers who have now been forced to flee Sri Lanka, who committed those war crimes. Obviously, the European Union's imposition of those trade-related sanctions, it may have led to Sri Lanka adopting measures of transitional justice, a proposal for a truth commission, a possible hybrid court within Sri Lanka, as well as a process of locating the disappeared, who were disappeared in the course of that long war. But what was important wasn't really the European sanctions, but the fact that elections were then called in Sri Lanka, leading to the ouster of that former government. So the politics locally need to be taken into account when looking at sanctions internationally. And these two often do not match. Obviously, the United States isn't really interested in the Philippines rejoining the ICC if the US itself doesn't want to join the ICC. The geopolitical interest of the United States is to use the Philippines as a wedge against its own rivalry with China. The European Union might have its own trade interests competing with China. And so these factors come into play. Enforcing human rights standards isn't exactly the priority of many of the European Union states, let alone human rights standards in a country that isn't even part of the European Union.
Thank you, Ruben. Justin, Aurora, there you have the floor.
Yeah. With regards to the question of Christina, I know her by her nickname. Anyway, yes, it looks like the UN, the human rights bodies at the UN seem to have really don't have what do you say a cohesive positioning on issues of human rights, because the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, Agnes Calamar, while she was still the rapporteur, has already said that there has to be stronger mechanisms that should be brought, that should be done by the UN also in relation to the war on drugs. And not just to look at, in fact, the direct perpetrators, but those who emboldened or made the law enforcement agents bold enough to kill, no? But that was not considered initially at the UN Human Rights Council. It was an inquiry that was suggested, but it is Secretary of Justice, De Guevara, who said that, no, we're now reviewing, we'll review. And because of that promise, they agreed to drop the inquiry and just proceed with technical assistance. Right now, there's also a problem because Secretary Guevara of the DOJ, who did not show any progress in their investigations, and in fact, it's not even a legal entity that has the mandate to really investigate. The panel, the review panel, is now the Solicitor General who will be defending government from any cases that the government might be sued for. So yes, if you look at the UPR recommendations, universal periodic review of the Philippines, different agencies like the Committee on Human Rights Committee for ICCPR, already there were recommendations that this should be investigated and that people should be made accountable. So I hope that the UN Human Rights Council, now that there was a statement of the Prosecutor Khan, that there's no evidence of any progress in really making people accountable at the domestic level, then they should reconsider the inquiry. Of course, they can continue the technical assistance, but there has to be a really impact of that technical assistance, not just training, because you can have all the trainings, but never change and never make people accountable and really give correct investigations. That report of Dr. Fortune already gives evidence that indeed the police tried to cover up, and there's even medical doctors involved because there are death certificates which said that it's pneumonia or hypertension or sepsis, and yet during the forensic examination of Dr. Fortune, there are bullet holes. They died because of gunshot wound. So that's one. And then, of course, again, there is that special treatment to the Philippines through the GSP project of the European Union, which Marco is mentioning. There has to be a fulfillment of the Philippine obligations in relation to the 7 core human rights instruments to which the Philippines is a party to. And so definitely with all this, what's happening right now, they shouldn't be able to pass the criteria that is necessary to get the special treatment again in terms of trade. So what will happen if they will not do that? Then the promise of an economic getting out of the economic crisis will be a big problem for the new government.
Thank you, Aurora. Justin, you want to add anything to this?
Yes, very briefly. I yield the questions on the ICC to both Sir Ruben and Doc Au, but I just like to add on Doc Au's point on as early as 2018. I remember when one of the EU party officials, Giacomo Filibec, was in the Philippines to meet families of the victims of the drug war, and later on he was expelled from the country in 2018. It was already floated that the sanctions on the GSP plus trade status between the Philippines and the European Union could be withdrawn. And I think another resolution was also filed this year stating some human rights concerns on the Duterte government, some involving the killings and on other broad number of human rights issues. But we can also debate on on how after years it's still not being pushed as a sanction to the Philippine government, or even on the benefits and effects of a sanction to the Philippine government with that in effect. But at the same time, I think it's very important with what Sir Ruben has already mentioned about expanding to the definition of justice beyond the courts. What I mentioned earlier about um, a bill filed in 2017 providing for a village-based public health approach. It was drawn from the work of advocates and a small village here in Metro Manila that worked on a public health and on a community law enforcement approach that could have been a model nationwide to ensure that the killings finally stop, regardless of what administration is sitting.
Thank you, Justin. We only have another 5 minutes, so if people in the room would like to pose a question, they have to raise their hand. In the meantime, we have a question in the chat from Ivel John Santos from Verifiles, or Dr. Paron or Attorney Ruben. Former President Duterte withdrew the Philippines from the ICC because he said that the Aquino administration failed to publish the Rome Statute in the official gazette after the Senate ratified it. Is that true? And this is the reason why they could withdraw so easily, if that is true?
If I may, I'll respond to this very quickly. That's a problem with having clowns as presidents. It's worse when you have clowns who are also murderers, because that's the worst possible combination of ignorance and impunity. This is a treaty, and the Philippine Constitution explicitly says that treaties are part of the law of the land. Once ratified, it becomes part of the law of the land, literally. Publication is publication. It's not what makes a treaty effective. What makes a treaty effective is ratification. And Marcos Jr. was one of those who ratified this treaty. So that's about it.
It couldn't be more to the point. Any other questions? No? So I thank everybody.
Sorry.
No,
Good evening, everyone. Attorney Ruben or Dr. Actually, Attorney Ruben, you mentioned earlier that ICC investigators may go to the Philippines and train some people here. I just want to ask, who are those people that ICC investigators may train in the Philippines? Are those coming from the civil society organizations, lawyers, or, well, I put it bluntly, police officers? So that's my question, Attorney. Thank you.
So there was another question from John. Please, Ruben.
Right. I'll just have to make sure that what I said was a hypothetical possibility, right? Hypothetical possibility, redundant, but just to be very clear about that. I am not saying that it will happen or that it's going to happen. It is a possible way to bring ICC investigators into the Philippines. There is a joint project between the Philippine government and the United Nations involving the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on capacity building. And yes, it's prosecutors, Philippine government prosecutors, as well as Philippine police officials who are part of this capacity building process. They could also, of course, involve civil society activists, because part of the project is to enhance civil society participation in accountability and human rights. Whether this, in fact, becomes an investigation done domestically by ICC investigators is a separate problem. The ICC has what is called a positive complementarity project, meaning it also tries to help governments be able to conduct its own investigations. Complementarity, as those who follow the ICC understand it, normally involves determining whether the ICC should exercise jurisdiction or not. But positive complementarity, in a way, approaches that from the point of view of the domestic courts, the courts of the country in which the crimes took place. And so the ICC has been helping some countries do just that. It can do it that way, but again, it depends on the new government.
So you have to be willing, not only able. Okay, thank you for the clarification, says Isabel. So Dave, back to you for conclusions. I think I would like to thank everybody, also on behalf of Jessica Sanson, who has been managing our live stream that is going to be saved on the DRCnet or stopthedrugwar.org accounts for further restreaming and then re-listening to. Goodbye from Rome.
Sure. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, especially to our speakers and Marco for moderating. Ruben, I wish we had had the Duterte as evil clown image to work with 5 years ago or so, but we'll continue to work with what we have today. And it looks like we are actually going to conclude on time this morning, this afternoon, this evening, for those of you in other time zones. So thank you. I'll lastly put my email address in the chat and some URLs for anyone who would like to be in touch. Thanks again, and have a good day and evening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you very much. I think the next available opportunity it will be taken again. Let's not forget that if there is necessity to reach out to the European institutions, come September, we will have to try and arrange something like today's debate within the European Parliament, at least, where we know there are a lot of human rights campaigners that also hold Philippines dear to their heart when whatever comes there. Ciao, ciao.